Right now, we're going to be joined by a circle of thought leaders who are joining us live from around the country to continue our exploration of tech for collaboration and connection. They'll address critical issues and their implications for us today. Here to lead the discussion and to introduce tonight's panelists is our moderator, tech journalist, Wired Magazine editor-at-large, and longtime friend of the museum, Steven Levy. Over to you, Steven.
Well, thank you, Marguerite. And it is such an honor to be hosting this panel to honor Ray and talk about some of his ideas. We have an amazing panel tonight. I'll introduce them. I'll only give the shortest of introductions because you can learn much more about them. You probably know everything about them already because they're part of our community here. First, Esther Dyson. She's a tech media pioneer, journalist, angel investor, health advocate. We got Baratunde Thurston, Emmy-nominated writer, activist, comedian, and finally, certainly not least, Danah Boyd, who is the partner researcher at Microsoft Research and the founder of Data and Society, visiting professor of New York University, and the goddess, I guess, of social sciences and networking. Welcome, all of you. I think we're going to talk about a lot of the implications of the connectivity that Ray helped bring into being and has been working on and for all these years. But first, I want to have each panelist maybe share a little bit of their connection with Ray and what they think of when they think of Ray and a connectivity. And we'll go on and tackle some issues from there. Esther, why don't we start with you?
Okay, so in order to prepare for this, first of all, I wore my Lotus shirt. And second, I went and read some things I had written about Ray and notes and groove and so forth back in the day. And it's amazing how much. So first of all, he was one of the nicest guys in the industry. He just, you heard his shout out to his wife. He's just a class act, and he was just fun to be around. I mean, he didn't just do collaboration software, he actually collaborated. The second big thing was, we still have the problem now. We used to have email, now we have Slack. But Slack and texting, they're getting as bad as email. There's just so much stuff there, you can't find it. And Ray's insight was that the text may be unstructured, natural language, etc. And so you can search it with words, but there's also structure to it. Emails, there's this wonderful term, speech transactions. And an email can be setting up a meeting. It can be an answer to another email. There's a structure to the communications. There's a structure to the work. 3 people contribute to that. One person changes it. Another person needs to be notified. And it's not all hierarchical. It's not just little pieces making bigger pieces. It's much closer to a web or a graph. And he understood that part of it and tried to help build in the structure of collaboration as well as just the stream of words and the mounds of data. A shared database has its own structure, but the structure of work among people is much more interesting, and it's something we're still wrestling with now.
Right, Baratunde, how about you?
Yeah, I grew up in the 80s, born in 77, got online around 93, and I have never met Ray Ozzie in person, though I love his initials order, REO, kind of a Speedwagonish vibe going there, Ray. So I used to fix computers to help pay for my college education, and I worked in computer networking in a small business in Cambridge, Mass, and they were on Lotus Notes. So my first interaction with Ray Ozzie's world was trying to fix some of the things that workers had to deal with. It was very exciting. And I was such a nerdy tech person that I was actually thrilled about Groove Networks. None of my friends, of course, knew what I was talking about, but I was in the know. I also just want to acknowledge and give a few quick shout outs to Mark Cuban, who acknowledged that he would be a bartender were it not for Ray Ozzie. So we can thank Ray for unleashing Mark Cuban on us. to Butterscotch, the most appropriately named artist with that smooth groove, and of course to Esther Dyson for the best Zoom background I've ever seen. Well done, Esther.
I thought it was a short-term joke, but it's a long-term joke.
Yeah, maybe too long. Dana, how about you?
No, it's so great to be here with everyone tonight. I was a student of Andy Van Dam's, another one of this class, when I was first learned about Ray's work. And I have to admit, I had met a lot of luminaries, working with Andy, that I had grown a little wary of a lot of them, where I'm like, I don't know that I actually want to meet them because they turn out to not always be so nice. And I have to admit, the first time I met Ray, I'm like, he's actually really nice. And I was like, oh, okay, maybe that's just this, this moment. And then I got to actually spend time with him working with him when I was at MSR. He understood and appreciated research. He understood and appreciated people who were more junior to him, helping elevate people, helping recognize talent in really profound ways. That, person who really understands how you build not just networks of technology, but networks of people. And it's about trust and respect, generosity and kindness. And so, I think that this is a moment where we're all celebrating his technical achievements, but I think it's also really important to acknowledge just what an amazing human Ray is. And that is the part that makes me so glad to be here tonight.
Yeah, I first met Ray myself in 1984 at the first Hackers Conference. It was kind of like a fun book party for me, but it's a gathering of the tribes that Stuart Brand and Kevin Kelly used to bring a lot of people together. And I got to know him a lot better in the 1990s when I was writing about cryptography. And it was so essential to Lotus Notes that he'd be able to provide security. And in the process, he wound up fighting for all of us to get encryption liberated from the government. But I really didn't get Ray totally till I did a long profile of him that actually you saw for like a few seconds in the main room for Wired magazine when he went to Microsoft and became chief software architect. And that was when he was building their cloud system. That's when I delved back into his Plato days. And we've already talked a lot about that tonight. But that was kind of a utopia for connectivity that was Ray's North Star. And I thought of that, and I thought about where we are now, because while connectivity has given us so much, in another sense, we have kind of a nightmare on our hands of some of the effects of connectivity. So in the few minutes left we have in this panel, I want to explore some of this with you brilliant people, to ask some questions like who's been building today's tech, and how can they be more collaborative and trustworthy, as you talked about, Dana, and how can we make choices that help tech better serve us and our communities? And maybe I'll start with you, Esther, because you were date back to the days when personal computers were unconnected. And you've watched that whole evolution as we started using them for conferencing and sharing and connecting. And I'm curious to know if you feel that sometimes in the early days, we were onto things that somehow we might have lost in the time since.
Well, there was certainly back when Stuart started the WELL, which stood for Whole Earth Electronic Link.
Yeah.
There was all these issues around anonymity. And even then, the problem isn't the technology, it's the people using it. And we, again and again, we forget that if you're going to create a large platform, you need to create the governance structure for it as well. I remember trying to find out from eBay how much money they spent on fraud and dispute resolution and stuff like that. And they would never admit how much it was. But it's like we need government, and even in the private sector or the, whatever you want to call the internet, it's kind of somewhere in between. Whenever you have a lot of power, some people show up and misuse it. And so I think transparency, the more power you have, the more transparency you need. If all you're going to do is walk down the street, you should have total privacy. And now, of course, if you walk down the street without a mask, you may be carrying a deadly weapon. And so that it's interesting how COVID-19 is to some extent upending some of our privacy issues. And it's also, to go off on a tangent, revealing a lot of, disparities in health and working conditions and so forth and so on. And those aren't things that the internet's going to fix. What the internet can fix is it reduces friction. We need to put some friction back in, actually.
Well, that's certainly what we had, that's why I asked you that in the earlier days. It was all about friction. Everything, was harder. You actually had to pay per minute when you were online, right? And now, we've got this abundance. Baratunde, you've watched that evolution since the 90s. And since then, it wasn't really quite as ubiquitous as it is now. And what came with that?
Good, bad, and ugly, Steven. And if we could just bring dial-up screeching sounds back, that would be kind of a nice feature. Maybe I can launch that as an NFT before the night is through.
I think it's a ringtone.
There you go. There you go. So there's so many ways to think about that question. I have the positive answer in my own evolution is watching this network technology and collaboration get beyond what is just enhanced broadcast. A lot of the ways we've seen people, companies, and other parties use these tools is to reach at people more efficiently and effectively, and then extract value from them more efficiently and effectively. So you can talk to more easily, maybe even listen to them more easily. But the ability to let people talk directly to each other, sort of edge to edge connections, that's been really powerful in my own creative endeavors in writing and politics, and also in people's political organizing. So I think that's a broadly good thing. It's a decentralization of power. But to add on to Esther's point, and what Danah said earlier about it's the people, it's the culture, it's the governance. I think a lot of us had maybe unwittingly hoped that it would just be sort of pro-democracy forces who wanted to use collaborative tools. And it turns out Nazis like to collaborate too. And that we would have a lot of sharing of files and a lot of collaboration around content, but not necessarily collaboration and sharing of the economic value created by that activity. And so we've created this world of tremendous concentration of power, hoarding of data, hoarding of influence, and extraction of value from the edge toward a very few points in the center. I don't think that's the grand, beautiful vision that we are capable of living up to.
Well, Danah, I know you talk a lot about where the human is in the interaction and, breaking through the impersonality of the screen. And so you watched as maybe things did veer somewhat off the rails. What happened between Plato and now to make that happen?
I think part of it is recognizing things have always been simultaneously off the rails and on them. It's not that there has actually been this moment where the internet was only used for good thing and never bad thing. And even now, it's not like all of it is bad. It's this complicated relationship. And Baratunde mentioned it, but it's sort of been my big commitment, which is the internet mirrors and magnifies the good, bad, and ugly. And I think part of what's challenging as a builder, you dream of all of the possibilities. You dream of what can be, what you hope you can create. And that's amazing. That's what makes a builder so powerful. And yet you also have to think about the checks and balances. Esther mentioned this challenge of governance, right? Which is this moment of saying you need people to think about where this is really going to go wrong. And you need the structures that are going to listen to that, because it's about finding that balancing act. And part of what is challenging is that, the days of Plato, the days of Well, the days of Usenet, this was a very small number of people online, and it was a lot easier to pressure people into social norms. But let's also acknowledge things like rec.pets.cats, which went way off the rails into recipes on how you could eat cats, right? Like there were a lot of things that went wrong. But then you add in layers of money and power and politics. You add in the possibility that if you game a system, you can profit significantly. You can build a business off of, arbitrage, if you will. And you started to see the financialization of the tech industry become a huge challenge for it. You started to see the gameplay. So we were all still imagining that this would be a tool of empowerment, but it did empower people. And it also created conditions that put people in vulnerable places. And I think that's this weird reminder about tools. They don't fix the problems in society, right? They don't come and say, hey, you had a problem in society. If you build a tool that connects the people, the problem will be done. And that's one of the things that I think about with regard to networks. Networks get made and remade. They're constantly negotiated. And one of the things that I think we have to constantly remember is, what are the networks that we need to function within our society in a healthy way? And how do we envision those kinds of networks rather than assuming that if we just build the technology, the networks will happen? And that's part of the beauty of this conversation, because there's a moment to envision what the world of networks should look like, not just assume that they will, if you build it, they will come.
Right. Well, Ray always gave a lot of thought to that. Now when we think about networks, we have this metaphor of turning the dials. That's how people are going to interact with each other. So the people who start the thing, the founders of these companies, they say, well, Mark Zuckerberg Facebook was successful because he turned the dials in the right way and hit a sweet spot. Now we wonder about those dials, right? So what do you think we have learned about how code creates culture?
I mean, I don't think it's the code. Sorry, Esther.
Okay, go ahead, finish.
Yeah, go ahead. Danah, you start. Esther.
Yeah. So I don't think that it's that code creates culture. I think culture is co-constructed with all of the tools around us. And I think that part of the dynamic is that culture is constantly being made and remade based on what we have available to us. And we heard beautiful music that is the co-construction of a phenomenal artist and a set of tools. That's also true here. And so I think it's also reminding that this is a constant iteration and evolution. And that's one of the reasons why it's important when we build systems that we also watch what happens to them as they evolve, because it has to be a constant dance. It can't be simply you put down a platform and assume that the culture that comes out of it is going to be what you imagined it to be.
Esther?
I think one thing that when the technology removes the friction, there's a lot of addiction going on the internet. And first I thought, oh, what a clever trope. Facebook is addictive. But in the last 5 to 10 years, I've learned that addiction isn't about the substance. It's about the behavior pattern of wanting relief and getting it. And it's short-term thinking in the extreme. So, I mean, it offends me that Robinhood says it's democratizing investing, because it's actually making gambling more accessible. And human beings are vulnerable to short-term thinking. We're vulnerable now to abundance because we evolved as a species to live in a time of scarcity and grab what we could find because we needed it. And now those same instincts are fostering. We're a short-term society, whether it's individuals or institutions looking for not just for sustainable profits, but they want to sell their businesses rather than run them. And it's the internet sort of creates this platform for everybody to be racing faster than the other guy. And somehow as a culture, we need to figure out how to resist that, how to put some friction back in, how to get people to think longer term. And it's a fundamental, huge problem that transcends the internet, but is very much, one-click shopping, all this stuff.
Can I jump in here, Steven? I don't know how we're doing on time.
Well, we're open to all here.
Yeah, so I want to add on to what I'm hearing here. It's really beautiful and thoughtful. I'm just like kind of honored to be surrounded by this greatness. 3 things that I think it's 3. We'll see if it ends up being 3, might be 2, that I think we've learned or are trying to learn. One is that there's power involved, and there's always like a contention or wrestling over power, and we're not engaged in a fair fight. I think the concentrations of like computing power, financial power, mathematical power, to Esther's point about addiction, the just say no thing doesn't work so much in some of these new network technologies. Like the atomic individual us is up against applied mathematics and behavioral science and trillions of dollars of market capital. And so that to say we choose these things isn't always the most honest version of events. The other thing I think we've learned in terms of re-injecting friction in is a lot of the building or the initial spark was kind of to escape the mess of people. We could codify it and thus avoid town hall meetings and human arguments and just embed it in the code. And then you just follow what the code says. But that's not democracy. And small d democracy is messy, and it requires us to engage with each other, to negotiate, as Dana was talking about, and be okay with the mess and work through it, not just click to opt out of it in the sake of efficiency as the highest human value. And the last thing, I saw something in the chat here, Computer History, and someone said Plato had sexist behavior on it too. And I think the third lesson that I keep trying to remember is we have to listen to the people who are telling us not everything's all right. And we can talk about the innocent time that was, but it wasn't that innocent for a lot of people. And so if we actively listen to the voices of folks who are being harmed or excluded or not heard, then we could make a system that's better for everybody. So more to learn, more to practice, but I'm like synthesizing all this dope stuff I'm hearing, and thank you. Yeah.
I want to add, thank you, Baratunde, that says it all, but I want to kind of take your ball and run with it slightly further. One of the most nice things I'm hearing lately, and I don't really know exactly how this is going to play out, but it's Jack Dorsey's idea of pick your own algorithms. And so, I mean, people who spend their lives, in Clubhouse or in Facebook, or it's not that they don't wish that they did that. It's like they always regret it afterwards. And so if you gave them the opportunity to pick, and if you let me, now I'm nicely centered. If you give people the tools to manipulate themselves, so instead of you go online and there's some algorithm manipulating you to generate revenues for somebody, you go online and you pick an algorithm that you pick to manipulate your own behavior. I want to watch, enlightening movies. I want to listen to inspiring authors. I want to watch hilarious comedians who actually have a social mission as well. I'm looking at you. It will help you do that. And I'm really excited and eager to hear what that turns into and how effective it becomes. But that's a real ray of hope to my mind.
I think to that end, we
Ray
may
of
also.
hope. Can we just acknowledge ray of hope?
I like that. Yeah.
Sorry,
Lieutenant
Dana.
Nestor?
No, I guess building off of this, I think part of it is to recognize that power dynamics are not just between individuals and the technology companies or the technology, but they're also interpersonal in all sorts of ways. I mean, we're seeing this right now where parents are trying to program children's lives, right? Children are not given opportunity to make their own algorithms, to make their own decisions, to make their own choices. And so they're looking for systems to escape. And we've seen that through this whole history. My childhood is one of just trying to escape the situation in my, growing up environment, trying to find people that were like me, but by my terms, with my agency, by my definition. And one of the things that I constantly keep minding of, and this goes back to Baratunde's point about listen to the people, right? Which is that I think that many of us who are in privileged positions to make choices, we want to control it. But there's also a ton of work that shows that people actually don't have those choices even when we think we give them those choices. And why is that? Because the issues of power and the issues of control actually go far beyond an individual in relationship to technology. And that's where I think, it's important to realize why people find pleasure through different forms of escapism. And they have found pleasure through escapism forever. And that escapism comes in the form of alcohol, that comes in the form of watching TV, that comes in the form of spending ridiculous amounts of hours on, a chat platform. But part of it is to recognize where that pleasure comes from and say, hey, what else have we structured within our society that leaves people where that's the point of joy? And are we okay where that's the primary point of joy? How do we actually think about that? And that goes back, Esther, to your earlier points, because I do think that this is about quick fix, because I think that that's how the financial system has been set up. I think that's how the political system has been set up. And so what we're seeing is that the technology is mirroring a lot of those other quick fix narratives. I mean, we should be having a governance system that doesn't require a politician to start, aiming to raise money the moment after they got elected, right? That's an unhealthy quick fix dynamic. And yet we're stuck in that. So I think we're dealing with a broader systems level issue where we're just seeing one slice of that pie.
I totally agree. It's not just the internet, but where I disagree is most of addiction is not about pleasure. It's about relief. And that's why it's so sad. But cheer us up, Steve.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. We've reached an interesting point here where we're, kind of like getting, like all like political and fired up. And I want to bring Ray Ozzie, our honoree, on the stage. Maybe after all this, he doesn't want to come on the stage, but there he is, Ray.
Hey.
Welcome and congratulations.
Hello.
Happy to see you.
It's great to be here. God, this was a great panel to listen to. I have to say, it's a little intimidating to to come into this group. Thanks for bringing me up here, and thanks for taking the time to do this. I really appreciate it.
So Ray, I want to ask you, I want you maybe to look back on the promise of connectivity that you saw and did so much to invent and promote. And what do you see now? Do you find that you're as optimistic as you were? Tell us a little bit about how you viewed this as it evolved.
Well, just to be perfectly direct, when we were working in the era that Esther was probably writing about us in, I don't think I did not have any illusions. I did not think there would be this level of connection at the consumer level in my lifetime. I knew that we would have computers in every home and computers on every desk, and my dreams were more in the restructuring of business and commerce around what would happen if you could eliminate friction among companies? Could you come up with new corporate entities who have common economic goals by reducing friction? Are big companies really needed anymore? Can the power of big companies, can that imbalance change over time because of the nature of small companies working with one another? What's gone on in the consumer realm is breathtaking and shocking, and for all the reasons that you folks have laid out. And I'm still puzzled why people did not recognize the power of friction earlier than now. It's we've been headstrong trying to remove friction, and simple things that we do in our human nature, like we have decay functions built into our relationships. It's just a natural thing, and that helps. It helps. We have forgetfulness. We have all sorts of things that that help us cope as humans, and has helped society thrive. And I hope, but I'm not optimistic, I hope that tool builders will start to experiment with some of these things as perhaps backlash or whiplash, against some of the horrible things that are happening because of the centralization of the platforms and the centralization of power around those platforms, and the fact that the realization that most people who use these platforms don't manage them. They allow themselves to be sucked into them and be taken advantage of. So I'm really not sure how to respond to that. I'm very optimistic on the commercial side. I'm not so optimistic on the political and societal repercussions of what we've created on the communication side.
Ray, you've at least you've given me a new way to view what happens when someone texts me and I don't know who it is. You know, the number is gone. I no longer have to feel bad and say, lost your number, who this? I can say, this is a natural feature of my evolutionarily sophisticated human decay function.
That's right.
It's a feature, not a bug. Peace out.
Well, I mean, these are really silly things, but you know, contact lists, address books,
Yes.
you know, friend lists, they should just have decay functions. Messaging should have decay functions. Everything, it would be different. It's different. I can't just wish this and have it happen everywhere, but maybe I will choose my algorithm, you know, to be one that everyone who has my contact decays away from me and vice versa.
Do you think, Ray?
Right. I mean, the people you linked up with on LinkedIn when you started, like everybody, and you know, now you become more discriminating.
Right.
Sorry, Baratunde.
No problem. I offer and ask. It feels to me like the automation that we feared, that sort of robots would take over, has actually been imposed on our own behavior. You know, we're the automated ones. We're expected to operate CRMs, you know, just to live a regular life and manage data and react and click repeatedly at high speeds, which is something that robots are literally built to do. I'm wondering if you have, you know, extended any other thoughts on that, how you react to the idea that we are kind of working for these things as opposed to having them work for us.
Oh, it is. It absolutely is. I don't know if you know, how you watch other people interacting with their phones, but they're just immersed, absolutely immersed. And so much of it is just instinct and just reaction, just swiping or tapping, double tapping, you know, double tapping because of an obligation that you've made socially, that you're going to be embarrassed if they don't think you paid attention to them. There are all these odd loops that have happened, and yeah, it's created within the platform, and we've had a good run of 10 years of experimentation in this platform to see how far we can go in that direction. And all I hope is that some entrepreneurs start to experiment with other mechanisms. I said this earlier on in an earlier part of the venue, but the pandemic has created a discontinuity in how we live our lives and in discontinuity in business. And I think it's incumbent upon us to take advantage of that discontinuity in what we build and in our perspective on things as we start to travel again. You know, as we go back and try to redefine what work looks like, and maybe now there's a discontinuity in administration. There are many discontinuities that happened. I think we should just be encouraging people to take new perspectives on social tools, organizational tools, and so on.
Speaking of those perspectives, sorry. So speaking of some of those interesting perspectives, I think one of the things I learned in thinking about designing of a system is to resist the desire to design and aim for the center with whatever definition of center that is, and to look for the outliers and the people who resist the technologies, because they often teach us the most interesting aspect of the technology. And indeed, you see some of your decay function in this. It's my favorite things of watching young people where they would go out of their way to jump platforms in order to encourage decay within their social worlds. It was very confusing for people who were like, well, why don't they love our platform? I'm like, because they've decided that they're in the 10th grade, not the 9th grade, and they want to shift in order to force decay. It was also some things where we often, like Snapchat, where people are like, it's about privacy. I'm like, no, it's not actually about privacy. It's about shifting and forcing the technology to do certain work for you. So it's like, instead of actually aiming for privacy and social norms, you aim to allow the technology to decay the image. And then if somebody went out of their way to capture it, that made them creepy. And I think about these moments because I see this all the time, even now in our weird COVID world. The outlier behaviors are the things that teach us the most. And yet, because we tend to look at the systems through data analytics, we tend to focus on whatever is within the curve rather than really purposefully looking at the edges. And I think that the edges are really the key for understanding where future possibilities are opportunities.
One other optimistic point. As we look at AI and start to realize how biased it is, it actually shines a mirror back on us, because the AI didn't get its biases by itself. It got its biases from the behavior of the people who we are mistakenly using as guides to the AI. And, long story short, let's use AI to fix that rather than to mirror it.
So I think that sort of the holy grail is that these technologies let us connect with each other as ourselves, whether our building selves to help us collaborate, or our social selves to help us be with each other. What Dana talked about, it's creepy when they, were exposed on that, is that, what made Snapchat successful is to let people be silly and not put up fake personas. And that lasted, I guess, a while, but and that's like, I think what you saw early on, what maybe Plato let you be, and what you wanted us to be, Ray, was ourselves connected.
Yep. I think that was well said. And again, it was absolutely, Baratunde, you're absolutely right. It was not a perfect environment. We got to see a little taste of the dark side of human nature, and none of these things are, people use it for illegal activities and things like that. But I tend to try to envision where these things could ultimately create good outcomes, and I'm still optimistic about that. But there's a big overhang, right, that we have to get past.
Well, I want to thank you, certainly, Ray, and congratulations again, and thank my wonderful panelists and the Computer History Museum. Thank you all. Good night.
Thank you, guys.